William Jacobson joins us right now, clinical professor of law and director of the Security Laws Clinic at the Cornell Law School. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
A couple of tweets here from the president so far. An hour ago, Russian officials must be laughing at the U.S. and how a lame excuse for why the Dems lost the election has taken over the fake news. And then he says we have a massive trade. 2 hours ago, we have a massive trade deficit with Germany, plus they pay far less than they should on NATO and military. Very bad for U.S. This will change. I voted for Donald Trump. I'm very honest about that, but he's got to let this election go. And I think it's brilliant the way he coined the term fake news, because now, Professor, whenever anybody that's a Trump supporter hears anything that he doesn't or she doesn't like, they attribute it to fake news. So I think public relations-wise, it's pretty smart, isn't it?
Well, remember the term fake news was invented by opponents of Trump. That's what they
Oh, really?
Yes. The original fake news was what the media used to refer to Breitbart News and several other outlets who were supporting Trump. Those were the original, and he took that and turned it around on the mainstream media. So I think it was, from a public relations, publicity, messaging point of view, a very brilliant move, because he took the term they were using against him and turned it around.
Kind of like judo, use their own weight against them.
That's right.
I've never taken judo, but that's what I read. So what do we got going here? The latest, I guess, Jared Kushner. They didn't say it was being investigated. I forgot exactly the term they used. Being looked into, interested, a person of interest?
I think the headlines use the term scrutinized, which sounds very ominous. But I'm very skeptical about those reports regarding him, and not just because they're based on anonymous sources. I mean, a lot of things are based on anonymous sources, but just the way they're phrased. They seem to be phrased in a way to make it seem worse than it is.
Pejorative.
It's pejorative.
Yeah.
Scrutinize sounds like they're suspecting he did something wrong. But that's not a legal term. Person of interest is not a legal term. He has volunteered. I mean, this is public. He's volunteered to appear before the Senate Intelligence Committee to testify. He's volunteered to meet with the FBI. It's been known for months that he had some sort of meetings or interaction with the Russians and with many others. I mean, he was the point person for the Trump transition team relations with foreign governments, so that's not shocking. So what you did is you have actually no news about him turned into a 4 to 5 day news cycle. I think it started Friday night, and we're still talking about it. So I don't think there's a lot there. The way the stories were described seemed very vague and unclear. So I just don't know that there's that much there. But the media does seem to be focused on him very heavily. I tweeted out a week or two ago saying now they seem to have moved on to Jared Kushner. And that's kind of been the MO of how the media has treated Trump, is they pick one person, and for 1, 2, 3 weeks, they focus very heavily on that person. We saw it with Kellyanne Conway relatively early in the administration. They wanted to marginalize her. So they took things she said out of context. They made fun of her photograph in the White House on the couch, et cetera, et cetera. And now they've moved on to Jared Kushner.
Well,
so
Sean Spicer was in the middle of that almost, wasn't he?
Well, Sean Spicer, they've mocked and parodied, and that's what is really going on here, that you have a mainstream media, which, if you've seen the clips of election night coverage, has never accepted Donald Trump's victory. Now, whether you like Trump or you don't like Trump, he was legitimately elected. He is legitimately the president, but they want to treat him like he's not.
Well, and they seemed so disappointed. They're talking about, I think it was the index out in the East being down and what a disaster is going to be for the stock market, and it turned out just the opposite. I mean, they were preaching doom and gloom. As circular as this may seem, when it comes to Jared Kushner, it really seems like there's no there, and we've been talking about it for 4 days, but Professor, in a way, again, as circular as this seems, you almost have to talk about nothing being there, so even though it never did really amount to anything, so that people don't get the wrong idea. Is that true?
Well, of course you do, and that's the whole point, is that, we don't know how this ultimately plays out. We only know what's been publicly disclosed, and what's been publicly disclosed so far shows no wrongdoing, no criminality, nothing regarding the election or the transition that would cause legitimate concern. Nonetheless, when the New York Times, Reuters, and the Washington Post, late on a Friday afternoon before a holiday weekend, roll out very similar stories, and it's curious how they all roll them out within an hour of each other, I think that it's something that's got to be addressed, because that creates a narrative that is, I believe, designed to completely undermine the president, and it's having that effect in many ways.
Well, let me say this. Friday afternoon before Memorial Day weekend, you got to fill column space, and that's not the best time to be looking for news if you're in the news business. Robert Mueller, so first off, in terms of two presidents at one time and back channels, when I read this, it's like, well, yeah, you'd have to be naive to think that there's not going to be an overlap with a transition team. And, the first day in office, you don't call up the Russians and say, hey, how you doing? And the importance of back channels when it comes to diplomacy.
Well, that's completely normal in a transition. In fact, Jared Kushner was the designated person to make that reach out to foreign governments, because you don't want to, be sworn in as president and have had no communications with most important foreign governments, be they friendly or not friendly. So the fact that there's a back channel, that sounds like such a nefarious term. All it means is preparing a transition so that your people know their people, there has been a line of communications, and you don't start talking to them for the first time. Now, it would be inappropriate if it crossed over into conducting diplomacy before you're sworn in as president, because we only have one president at a time. But there's no evidence that happened. There's no evidence that the so-called back channel to Russia actually was ever implemented. There's no evidence that the idea for it came from the Trump administration. And so there's just a lot of things floating out there that are phrased in ways to make Trump look bad. But when you actually dig down to it, at least based on what's been disclosed so far, there's nothing actually wrong with it. And that's what the whole media cycle has been. And they roll out these new stories day after day after day. For example, CNN has a story that hit this morning in which they say they have been told that the Russians thought they had compromising financial information on somebody in the Trump transition or Trump campaign. But we don't know who it is. And this is literally what CNN is saying. We don't know who it is. We don't even know if it's true. But this is what we're hearing. And that's news, so that's going to be the focus of the news today. Really, the media has done incredible damage to itself. They went into this presidency with historically low ratings of trust in the media, and they are playing out day after day why they don't deserve to be trusted. And that's not a good thing in the long run, because one of these days they will actually come up with a legitimate, truly scandalous story, and nobody's going to believe them.
Professor, in terms of Robert Mueller, let me ask you a couple of questions that are coming in from the listeners. One of them says, you have to report it on your security clearance, Tommy, something several of Trump's cabinet members didn't do. Report what? Do you have any idea what this means?
Well, I've heard about claims that Comey was supposed to, I don't know if that's what they're referring to, supposed to have reported any suspicions, things like that. But I don't know if that's what the listener's referring to. But if that's what he's referring to, the law in question is very vague. I'm not sure that Comey had to, report any attempts to influence him. So I don't think there's a lot to that. But again, I'm not sure what the listener is referring to.
All right, your guest speaks as this one, Professor, as if Kushner's story is isolated. Is your guest comfortable with Trump's relationship with the Russians? Do we know what that was yet?
Well, that's the whole issue, that we have to go, in my view, based on the evidence that we have, not on the suspicions. And so far, there's been a lot of innuendo, et cetera. We don't really know what the relationship was, but I don't think there's any reason to presume that it was unlawful or improper in some way. There's no evidence of that. So, again, where I've always come back to on this is not Trump did nothing wrong. It's that the burden is on the people making the accusations and the innuendo to give us actual facts, give us actual evidence. Until they do that, I'm going to presume that the president is the legitimate president of the United States and didn't commit something that's an impeachable offense and so on. So I think people have turned it around, or the media and the Democrats, the so-called resistance, have successfully turned it around, that the burden is now on the Trump administration to prove they did nothing wrong. But I think the burden should be the opposite. It's on the critics to prove that they did do something wrong. And so far, they've come forward with zero facts to prove that.
So Robert Mueller, where does he start? And, a big problem has been leaks. How much could leaks jeopardize that investigation? And do you think there will be any leaks with Mueller conducting the investigation?
Well, I think that the special counsel may be an example of don't wish for something, you may get it, from the media Democrat side, because already we've seen there are fewer leaks coming out, at least of the prosecutor's office, not necessarily of the intelligence agency. And I think Mueller will have the effect of actually reducing the flow of information to the media, because already we've seen that James Comey had to postpone his appearance before the Congress. I forget if it was the House or the Senate, because doesn't want to do anything to jeopardize the investigation. And I think what you're going to see is a lot of these public hearings, or hearings that would have been public, are now either not, or probably not going to take place, or you're going to have somebody like Comey saying, well, I can't get into that because it might jeopardize the investigation. So by appointing a special counsel, it will actually lessen the flow of information to the public.
So what would Donald Trump what would he have had to have done with the Russians for it to be an impeachable offense?
Well, I think that, well, first of all, impeachable offense is essentially whatever the House of Representatives wants to decide in impeachable offenses. But I think the way most people would commonly understand it is that if there was something going against the interests of the United States that took place, if there was something like that, but I can't really predict what it would be. Certainly in this instance, if he actively undermined existing U.S. foreign policy, I don't think merely talking about what's going to happen once we get into power, once I take office, in and of itself is a problem. So I don't really know what the allegation is. I mean, remember, there were supposedly back channels between Obama and the Iranians prior to Obama taking office. There were back channels between Reagan and the Iranians. I don't know why it always seems to be the Iranians before Reagan took power. The alleged arms for hostages deal, those sort of things. So there's a lot of history of incoming administrations having communications, even policy communications, again, because you don't want to be sworn in on January 20th and start like you've never spoken to these people. So I don't know what would be there, but it would have to be something that was going truly against the interests of the United States, beyond merely talking about what's going to happen once I take office.
Anything we're missing, Professor, you wanted to add?
Well, no, just I think that we're in actually a very dangerous news cycle. I don't mean this week news cycle. We're in a cycle where the media has decided from the night of the election that it does not want this person who was elected to be president. And they have set out to take him down, and they're doing it through innuendo, and they're doing it through actively encouraging the leak of classified information. And I think it's a very dangerous period of time. We need a strong media. We need a legitimate media. And I think the end result of this, if they don't come up with the goods, if they don't come up with something solid, that Trump did something wrong in this transition, then I think the media is going to experience a backlash, much like they've been experiencing in recent years, where the trust in the media is the lowest it's ever been. So I think it's very dangerous what the media is trying to do.
Let me sneak in another question here, because being an amateur lawyer or a wannabe lawyer, I think people confuse opinion sometimes with what's legal and what's not. And a text comes in and says, Trump attempted to obstruct the investigation against him. That in itself is impeachable, but there's no legal groundwork for that, is there?
Well, there are laws against obstruction of justice, but they require some sort of corrupting sort of influence. So imagine if somebody under investigation went to the prosecutors and the lawyer for somebody under investigation and said, hey, my client's a really good guy. Can you cut him a break? Nobody's going to call that obstruction of justice. But that's what they're accusing essentially Donald Trump of doing with James Comey regarding Michael Flynn. Hey, he's a nice guy, blah, blah, blah. I mean, so it would have to be beyond that. It would have to be, I'm going to, do this or I'm going to do that unless you let him go. It's going to have to be almost like, quid pro quo. It's going to have to be some corrupting sort of influence beyond expressing an opinion that some guy's a good guy and, doesn't deserve the treatment he's getting. So I don't see that there's anything there based on the reports. But, of course, we don't know exactly what was said. All we know is that there was a leak to the newspapers, that James Comey wrote a memo that suggested the president was pressuring him. I think it's got to go beyond that to show legally obstruction of justice.
Thank you, Professor. Hope we can get you back on again.
Okay, take care.
You have a good day. William Jacobson, clinical professor of law and director of the Securities Law Clinic at the Cornell Law School.